I was not kidding when I said that Vivek is a YouTube star, but Vivek is one of the most followed people in the LNG universe. We ran into a little bit of a hitch on this panel last weekend when one of the panelists that we had planned for this had to drop out last minute thanks to tariffs that were declared on Mexico and Canada. And this particular speaker was developing an LNG project in Mexico. So you can understand the drivers there. So I reached out to Vivek, and Vivek gave me a name, and I emailed this person, and this person said, you've sent me like 3,000 emails, but the only reason I opened your email is because the subject line says referred by Vivek Chandra. And then Shaun said, I'm happy to accept only because Vivek's going to be on the panel. So Markus and Blake, sorry, but this this is going to be an interesting panel here. So I'm super excited. As I said this morning, natural gas and LNG are in a very interesting space right now. So lots of stuff to talk about. Vivek, you're trying to get an LNG project off the ground. How is that going? Tell us a little bit about your project.
Yeah, so nice to be here. It's always a pleasure. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you, my good friend Shaun. We both, I had as much hair as he did when we started the business, and look at me now. Look at him now. So I'm currently developing a project called Gulfstream LNG. It's in Louisiana. I previously co-founded and developed a project called Texas LNG, which was supposed to reach FID last year, and it's having a few hiccups, so it'll get to FID hopefully this year. So it's my second time around trying to develop a large-scale export project in the US, and it doesn't get any easier, let's put it this way. And it's never a dull moment in our business, this thing. Every day you wake up and you never know what the headlines are going to be. But it's fun, and I think that we can talk about that, some of the recent headwinds. Last year was a tough year to be developing projects for many reasons. I think now the mood seems to have changed, but there's a lot of uncertainty. Good news, every piece of good news comes with a bit of bad news. We got, the export tariff is being lifted and export review is being lifted, but now we might have a 25% tariff on steel, good and bad kind of thing. So we'll see how it goes, but yeah, it's quite exciting. So our project is to let you know we are in the FERC process. We're the first new greenfield project to be in the FERC process in 5 years. So we like to think there's lots of new projects in the US. There actually are not that many, and it's very hard to get a project off the ground. It's very hard to get through that first hurdle of FERC, and we're hoping to get to the application of FERC in the next few months. So it's quite good.
Thank you, Vivek. Shaun, tell us a little bit about Pilot LNG, and again, thank you for helping us by stepping in at the last minute.
My pleasure. So Pilot LNG is a startup company looking to develop small-scale LNG marine fuel bunker projects. So previously, actually, a little bit of context, I was a neighbor of Vivek while I was leading the regulatory work for a large-scale LNG export project down in South Texas. So I had the pleasure of going through the FERC process. And so actually doing the small-scale, Pilot is a joint venture partner with a New York private equity fund called Libra Group. Their subsidiary CPATH is the partner. And so we are developing a small, standalone LNG bunker project in the city of Texas City, so in Galveston Bay, sort of the largest deep water port complex in the US. If you think of Port of Galveston, Port of Houston, and the Port of Texas City, over 10,000 deep draft vessels. And as you can probably imagine, in the marine industry, they're looking to do emissions improvements and decarbonization. And so from our standpoint, made a lot of sense. We started the project in this particular location a couple of years ago. We're not a FERC project.
Like you.
Lots of
like you.
Yeah. And so currently, as designed, actually we are of the 6 permits that are required for a non-FERC regulated project with the federal agencies. We have 3, and we're hoping the last 3 come within the next 2 months. So we could well be on our way from a permitting standpoint. We're in a good place. As usual, the customers are the challenge. I'm sure that'll come up, and I'll talk about it in more detail. But hopefully FID Q3 this year. So it'll be the first of its kind on the Gulf Coast. If you need something to compare it to, Jax LNG over in Jacksonville, Florida is the only other, if you will, standalone dedicated LNG bunkering facility currently in operation in the US.
Thank you, Shaun. Markus, you have a slightly different perspective. One, you're based in Europe, so these guys are trying to sell LNG to you. But then second, you are with a company that provides a wide range of services to a lot of key components in the natural gas LNG value chain. So maybe tell us a little bit about Hoerbiger and maybe your perspective on how Europe sees the need for LNG today and going forward.
Thank you, Uday. Working for Hoerbiger, a company that is, this year 130 years in existence. And we provide technology for reciprocating compressors and services. So we have both the natural gas side, upstream, midstream, and the LNG side in our focus. And what we see now as one of our focus, especially in innovation, is whatever we can do to help reduce the cost, making equipment more reliable, more efficient. Digitals predicting runtime of equipment to time service intervals, but then also the field of providing technology that takes care of the methane emission side of reciprocating compressors. And I think here it ties very well together with all what we have heard today in the morning already. So that is something that keeps us up and where we have a lot of interest and a lot of momentum in that market.
And when it comes to the public perception of gas, LNG in Europe, what's the mood right now? I guess what's the broader sentiment around gas and LNG in Europe?
Natural gas always had a very high share in the European energy markets. LNG had never had a very big role, but with the war of Russia and Ukraine, that has changed substantially. And you see that in the export numbers from the US. I believe from a European perspective, LNG has come, it's there. There's a lot of infrastructure that has been built in the past couple of years, and it's there to stay. I think on the long run, what market share it will take in Europe is something to be seen. But the cost side will be one element, and then also a way of how well is LNG addressing the emission legislation that is upcoming in Europe and actually is in place since end of last year. So that's going to be then seen. With a second element and I think that's a big advantage of LNG. The European markets have a very high focus of self-dependence and not depending on one source of primary energy. So there's naturally a very strong push for renewables in Europe because that's the only thing that is available. There's no natural gas available, not of significant size in Europe. And I think natural gas will be a super complementary energy source to have the stability of the energy supply. And here, I think that LNG will continue to have the majority of the share in Europe.
Thank you, Markus. Blake, tell us a little bit about your company and how you interface into the LNG value chain.
Yeah, so thanks for having me here. I think I'm one of the stand-ins, but interesting, a lot of the discussion's been around exports, and I focus on the import side. I work for Energos Infrastructure. I'm our Chief Commercial Officer. The company's based in Stamford, Connecticut. It's about a $3 billion asset company. We're owned by Apollo Global Management, which has $650 billion under asset management, and ultimately we're owned by 3 energy infrastructure funds. We have 13 vessels. I don't know, I had brought a slide. I don't know if you could put it up or
is, hang on, I think it's with me.
Yeah, so we own 13 assets. So we're basically in the floating energy infrastructure business. We have 9 floating storage regas units. Yeah, so this just gives you an idea of our fleet. These vessels are effectively, I think it's pretty impressive. I like what I do, obviously, but and Shaun used to be in that business. We were both working at competitors, chasing projects. We have 13 vessels, about 3 football fields long, half a football field wide, 30 personnel, but effectively it's a LNG import terminal on a vessel. And there are about 50 projects like this in the world today. Really kind of got started back in 2000, 2005, 6 timeframe, and I've had a chance to work across a number of companies for 10 years. So this is the business we're in. We're not interested in the commodity. We're interested in just providing the floating LNG infrastructure. We typically lease it under long-term agreements. The thing that's potentially interesting, a good segue to what Markus said is, we are global in nature, but we are the largest provider right now in Central Europe. We have 2 vessels in Germany, 1 in the Netherlands, that reacted to the Ukrainian-Russian war and providing energy independence for those countries. We're the largest provider of FSRUs in Brazil. There's 8 in Brazil. We have 3. We're also in Indonesia, in Jordan, and we recently announced a project in Egypt, which is basically desperate for gas, and we'll move the vessel from Jordan to Egypt. So exciting time to be in this business. And the other thing I would say is that when I was offered the chance to come, it was, hey, Blake, maybe you can work the energy transition schedule, which is tomorrow. And I was in energy transit. I was in LNG for many years. I was in energy transition for a year and a half, long enough to know I better go back to LNG.
Smart move.
Thank you, Blake. So, Vivek, I guess what's the investor sentiment like for LNG projects today, right? And if you look at what happened with Venture Global's IPO, for example, conceptually, the IPO happened as right around the time President Trump took office, and conceptually the timing couldn't have been better. But they had to cut the size of the valuation by almost half. And then even after the stock floated, there's been a significant decline in pricing. So it tells us that investors are super cautious irrespective of a regulatory policy environment that should be conceptually a lot more supportive than, let's say, the Biden administration, right? So I guess what are you hearing from investors?
Let me just, correct something about the Venture Global IPO. The current market cap is 50 billion. So there's nothing to sneeze at. I don't consider that not a success at all. They're worth almost the same or the same as Cheniere, who's been in the business for a long time and pioneered the business. So maybe it's a question of too high expectations and coming back to reality. But in my view, you're worth, literally they're, under construction and producing and under development around 50 million tons, plus minus, you can argue the numbers. And they're worth 50 billion. It's $1 billion or 1 million tons. I think that's pretty damn good. So I don't think it's a thing now. So let me rewind. I'm here as an independent trying to raise money for developing projects. And the first time around at Texas, I think the sentiment was a lot more positive. It was a lot more open. It was kind of the cowboy type of the industry. You could go out there and literally walk into a fund's office in New York and walk out with a bunch of money. And that's kind of what exactly happened to us. It was kind of a surprise how easy it was. This time around, it's been unbelievably difficult. Part of it is, there's still not a realization that American LNG is a game run by entrepreneurs. When I had run around the world and I was in Europe last week and everywhere else, people always like, well, you're not Shell, you're not Exxon, you can never do this. And I tell them, and I had to remind them that I have 100 million tons of LNG America produces today. 80 of it is coming from entrepreneurs and 20 of it's coming from utilities like Sempra. So there are no Exxons and Chevrons and Shells in the American space right now, and the ones that are struggling to make it work. So I think that mindset is difficult. And then, of course, over the last couple of years, we have been, I call it peak foolishness in a lot of different fuels. Hopefully we've gone past peak foolishness, but that's really changed the sentiment of some of the financial institutions. We have mentioned earlier this morning about European banks. European banks were instrumental in getting American LNG industry off the ground. We all have dealt with the SocGens and the BNPs and all of these guys, and they've pretty much disappeared. And I think they probably regret that decision because they're leaving a lot of money on the table, so to speak. And so when the banks disappear, that is harder for them, the venture capitalists, to come in because they see the banks as coming in and taking them out and providing that final project funding that required to make the project get built. So I think the public statements are the banks making it difficult. And let's be completely honest, there's been quite a few American projects that have started. Many of them are no longer with us today. And some of them that are with us, and even the ones that have left, some of that money was incredibly highly squandered by the founders. So a lot of early investors actually lost a lot of money in US LNG. And so, we're trying to say, hey, we're one of the good guys. We're not going to do that. We've learned from our mistakes, etc. So it's an uphill battle. I always felt that it was hard to get institutions actually in Houston interested in investing in LNG. It's easier to get New York and London and Paris interested in LNG than Houston LNG. I've never made any headway at all with the local funds and all that because they're too busy with reserve-based lending and some of the other things. So, I think we're all much more efficient now. The kind of money that we're talking about, we can make it go a lot further. Everybody understands the process a bit more. I think we are much more better custodians of our money, but it's damn difficult. It's damn difficult to raise money.
Shaun, you are serving a completely different customer segment, right? I mean, this is a customer segment that's buying much smaller volumes, for marine transportation applications. First of all, is that a fair assessment, or do you see that differently?
Yep, totally different markets. And there's a couple of interesting layers there because you've got the LNG becoming sort of the primary fuel of choice for this decarbonisation or moving past the traditional petroleum fuels. So you've got the LNG industry and everything's huge and 20-year contracts. And then you've got the maritime industry where that vessel just rocks up into a port. They pick up the phone and say, "Hey, just drop off a stem of fuel." And so trying to bring those two things together in this bunker space has been quite a challenge. You need some term length on the contracting and commercial side in order to get infrastructure built. On the other hand, we're not going to get 20-year contracts from the shipping industry. The shipping industry has to recognize calling up on the date isn't going to work. And so they're starting to see some movement now. You're starting to see some 7-year term deals in various parts of the world. Now some of the cruise lines are talking about 10-year. They're willing to go to 10 years. So there is a merging, if you will, of ideas on how to get this in place. The other one that probably surprises people when we talk, and it may be a question later, but I'll spring it now, is why do you guys want to develop a standalone small-scale LNG facility project in the US Gulf? Isn't the US Gulf just flooded with LNG? And I think, again, that was part of the challenge we had with the customer base in the shipping industry, where there's more LNG than you can throw a stick at in the Gulf. Why would we pay for a dedicated facility? And the reality is that LNG is not available from those large-scale export projects. Those large-scale export projects are multi-user facilities. The berth slots are like gold. They're not owned by the terminal per se. They're owned by these super majors who have their offtake capacity and then have the rights to that 48-hour window. And so those things are full all the time. And so there's no room to bring in a little vessel to get a thimble full of LNG and be able to dedicate that supply on a weekly basis to a cruise line that needs it to leave port. So certainly, with that big picture, people thought, that's a crazy place to do an LNG bunker project. But actually, the LNG availability for the marine industry is not there in the US large-scale terminals. And so getting the customers past that as well has also been a challenge. So there's a couple of areas that we've had to work hard on the downstream side to get them to understand very different industries.
But how is it raising financing for a project like that?
Oh, God. We kissed a lot of frogs, let me tell you. And you know, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good.
Yes.
You know, if you're in the marine space, you know, I'm telling this story to somebody else. There's the maritime academies from Maine to New York to Texas A&M Galveston, and there's a little bit of a maritime mafia going on, and it was pure happenstance that we Blake mentioned it, I worked for Accelerate Energy in the FSRU space, and it was an old colleague who's now in Dubai, got together with a bunch of New York Maritime Academy alumni, and they had been backed by a New York private equity fund to get into, you know, Jones Act shipping and marine infrastructure. And the two of them just put us together, and after spending a lot of time, as Vivek said, knocking on a lot of doors, suddenly out of the blue we had a wonderful partner and you know, project funding, and here we are, maybe, you know, 6 months from FID for this project. So I'd like to tell you it was you know, we were brilliant and smart and sophisticated and had a fantastic idea, but sometimes it's just the bounce of the ball in this case. Now, once we got the funding, we were brilliant, charming, smart and sophisticated to get it to this point. But yeah, before that, it's a crapshoot out in the development world.
Thank you. Markus, when you look at the natural gas infrastructure, right, and where do you see pain points? Where do you see customers coming to you and asking you for help and support?
I think it's, and maybe less on the LNG side, but in the other applications, is a continuing journey, and bringing equipment reliability and with that cost down always to the next level, and how to implement digitalization in that industry that wasn't maybe a digitalization starter, but now catching up very, very rapidly. And the second element is technology to address emissions, where you always have to balance the two sides. On the one side, the intrinsic motivation to do something with stewardship. On the other hand, it needs to fit into cost and return of investment buckets. Having said that, what we see right now with all of the dynamics going on, that industry has gained speed and momentum that in the 27 years that I'm in that industry haven't seen in the past. And that is a challenge to come up with new ideas, develop them, test them, and they should be working when they are installed in a larger scale.
And is there, I guess, how are operators responding to these new technologies, whether it is for digitalization or whether it is for emission reduction?
Also differently. You always have operators that do things because they want to lead the pack from the top, and could call them early adopters. And there's enough to do with these type of companies. And then to see how does it fit. I think with emission products or emission technology and digitalization, a thing that we have not seen in the past so much is very, very soon a much deeper level of integration has to start. And it's when it goes into digital products, dealing with security and cybersecurity and then confidential information. That is something that from where our business was historically, which is more on the hardware side, we were not used to. And this is coming much stronger. And then it's always what we see positively, because you could say there's some level of long-term uncertainty, because nobody knows how the European side will develop over the next years. It has so many different questions let alone how is natural gas coming from Russia. So there's a lot of uncertainties in an industry that requires long-term stability to justify the big investments that go into that industry. And that is something what we need to answer with much shorter and less expensive development cycles, much more than it was needed in the past.
Thank you, Markus. Blake, I guess, what does growth look for you, for your company?
Yeah, so we, as mentioned, we have 13 vessels and all those vessels are employed. My job is to help grow our platform. So we're looking for new development projects out there. I'd say when you look at the development pipeline, we probably have 25, 30 projects in sight. I'd say 4 or 5 are high priority and 6 to 8 are medium priority. The higher priority are at term sheet stage. And what's the point there is that I think it's a really strong story about the demand for LNG right now. A lot of the projects we chase are in developing markets. Of the 4 projects I have, 3 are in Latin America. And they are LNG to power projects in most cases. And then we see demand right now. We have projects, likely Bangladesh is coming into the market. Malaysia is out with a request for information. Indonesia is looking for multiple FSRUs. There's a lot of demand out there, but I was kind of laughing when the keynote speaker earlier today, when he was asked about, are they going to expand internationally? I was thinking that was the right answer. It's very complicated and complex, each of these countries that we're working to develop projects in. They have their own story, their own challenges, and that's what we're chasing. But there is a very robust, there's a lot of LNG in the market that needs to be put away. There's a lot of developing non-OECD markets that want LNG, and the FSRU represents about 25% of the terminals today, and it's growing. So floating energy infrastructure there in the state.
Is this working? Maybe you can use this.
Yeah, and so growth is a big part of us. As I mentioned, we're owned by Apollo Group, and the intention of the company is to grow considerably. But one of the big opportunity in the market right now is to fill the gap. We're in the business of enabling new markets. Over my career, I've had the chance to develop projects in Indonesia and El Salvador, Chile, et cetera. In many cases, people say the projects will never happen. But they get off the ground, and excited to be developing new projects globally.
So are there some defining features, drivers, and market needs that lead to projects that are successful in this?
Yeah, if I've learned anything, I've been in the business for 20 some years, and it's all about, I once had a boss to me that said, Blake, it's all about the bookends, both the upstream and the downstream. But to be honest with you, it's who's buying the gas. Who is buying the gas? Who's writing the contract for the gas downstream? How strong is the credit of them? That's a big challenge in many of these markets, is to understand the underpinning credit that's going to drive the value chain.
So it's another version of who's the off-taker for this gas, right? I mean, that's, Vivek, I'm assuming you're spending a lot of time on finding off-takers, but you...
Not exactly.
No?
No.
So...
I think that's like, that's what we did the first time around. I think we spent a lot of time chasing off-takers because it's fun, and who doesn't want to go to Tokyo and eat good sushi? We all do. But in the end of the day, it costs a lot of money and a lot of resources, and it doesn't move the needle. To me, maybe I've learned, maybe I'm just trying a different way, but to me, unless you have a project to sell, you have nothing to sell. And the market, as we saw with the Ukraine war, when the market's ready to buy, they all buy all together. You can beg them all you want for years and years, but when they want to buy, suddenly in Germany it took 20 years and no terminal could get built, and suddenly in 1 year they built 5 terminals. When it has to happen, it'll happen. So I'm much more focused right now in developing the project, getting the permits, because at least we have this regulatory certainty that once you get the permit, it's worth something. Or we like to think we do. I think both Shaun and I know that the regulatory certainty doesn't exist, and both of our previous companies have lost their regulatory certainty permits at one point or the other. But, I think as a startup, you have to worry about where your resources are. And I think the resources for me, the money that I have, I'm better spent developing the project, getting it to the permitting stage, then other investors will take it more seriously. And when we have the line of sight to when we'll get that FERC permit, that's always the big unknown, because unless you have that end date, CapEx doesn't mean anything, prices don't mean anything. When we have that line of sight, when the FERC is working on the EIA, for instance, we know we're 6 months out from the permit. That's when you start marketing and seeing what the market has to do. I think the old philosophy was, let's sign up a Shell and, at this giveaway price and other people will come. It's a waste of time, in my view. So I'm much more interested in getting a project going. Make sure if you're competitive in the US Gulf Coast, all the projects are pretty much the same price. Let's be honest, in the end of the day. If you're competitive on the Gulf Coast, you're competitive with everybody else, the market will come, and the market really doesn't discern between project A and project B. They want US Gulf Coast LNG, they'll buy it at the right time.
So I think what you're saying is that there is sufficient demand for LNG. If it comes to the market, then somebody will buy.
I'm not concerned about demand. I'm a huge believer in demand. I travel the world for fun and for work, and every country I go to wants more LNG. Literally, if you have a coastline, you want LNG. There's not a country in the world that doesn't want LNG if they have a coastline. Even the ones that don't have a coastline. I was in Romania, which I guess it's the Black Sea coastline. I was in Romania last week, and they want LNG. So everybody wants LNG. So I think that we are now realizing that LNG is, in Europe this last week, I heard not only the transition fuel, but it's the end fuel as well. More people are saying it's the end fuel. Forget about this transition stuff. It is where we need to get to. So I think the demand is there, and the US has this great advantage because, 9 times out of 10, we'll always be the cheapest LNG in the world. There may be that 1-10% chance, as you showed in your graph, when the price dips, but more than likely, you're always the cheapest in the world. So let's develop an efficient project here. Let's keep the CapEx low. Let's keep the cost of development low, because the reason only 20% of the projects make it this far is because they piss away all their money. They're not very good with the money. So keep that money tight, do that project development in a smart way, and then when the market is ready to buy, you're there when they need it.
Does that apply to small scale LNG? Is the market there if you bring a project to fruition?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, so there's a couple of layers to this. Yes, the market's there. In fact, the early adoption, if you follow LNG in the press, or LNG marine development in the press, there's going to be something like 12 to 1,300 ships by 2028 that are LNG fuel every week, or almost once a week. There's 24 container vessels have been ordered for LNG. It's just constant. So the market is absolutely there. But to echo Vivek's point, there's a lot of risk money at the front end that went into the development, spending the money on the engineering, spending the money on the development, spending the money on the permitting, to get to the point where we were, not through the permitting process, but had all of that material in, getting our public notices back from the Army Corps, from the public notices from the TCEQ here in Texas for air. And only then did the downstream customer start to go, wow, this now looks credible. And now it's worth our time to start engaging in some serious discussions about our offtake. Even though it's a much smaller scale, there's no question the investors are putting still a tremendous amount of money at risk to move it along, versus showing people information on the back of a napkin and saying, trust me, if you sign up today, we will then build it. So a lot of risk at the front end. I do take issue with Vivek saying there's demand everywhere. I can tell you at least one country that has absolutely not wanted LNG, and it's been a pain in my backside for about 5 years. Yes, Ireland. My gosh, man, they've just been absolutely hell-bent on First it was no LNG, then it was no fracked LNG, even though they've got one pipeline coming from the UK, and the UK imports a lot of US LNG. And the bigger story there is, I think, what keeps you up at night, it's politicians like that who have an absolute, what I think of as a very strange mentality on energy value to a country, where they are adamant that they don't need, whether it's natural gas or other traditional fuels, and are running on this charge to renewables only. And the cost of energy in Ireland and in the UK, as it happens, is the highest in Europe. But as an example, LNG would make a lot of sense in Ireland, which has a liquid gas market. But they have done everything they can to avoid LNG infrastructure, to give them, if you will, another leg to their stool. Their offshore fields have now completely depleted. They've got one pipeline coming from the UK, and they've got a gas transmission system that runs throughout the country. But they are just doing everything they can to avoid taking steps to ensure a reasonably priced gas supply, which would ensure a reasonable energy base. And the sort of the example of where that can lead to is the UK right now, with their rush to net zero. I think within the last 6 months they've closed the only steel mill in Port Talbot. They just announced the closing of the Scotland's only refinery and chemical plant at Grangemouth in Yoss. And then I believe last week Yara International announced the closure of an ammonia facility. And in all those cases, it was energy costs. And so they're losing a tremendous amount of manufacturing base, and how that would ever come back, I'd be shocked. So that's a little bit of a rant as I roll into politics and what things kind of hold up.
But so Markus, coming to you, right? I mean, I think when we met in Vienna, right, we had a good discussion on this, right? I mean, the European sentiment around LNG has changed, or broadly natural gas has changed quite a bit in the last 3-4 years, right? I mean, it went from this is not a bridge fuel, this is not a transition fuel, to we need this for energy security. And I think probably right now that's where the sentiment is, probably from my reading of Financial Times or whatever, right? I'm curious, right? Like Vivek's almost arguing that no, this is the end fuel. This is not a bridge fuel. This is the fuel that we will all end up with. Do you see that view within Europe today?
Yes, definitely.
I mean, with exceptions of some countries that...
Yeah, I mean, I think you can't just paint a broad brush and say Europe. Yeah. I think you have to look at very specific examples, because it's not just one monolithic market. I think this goes back to Blake's point about where he's looking at projects, and everything is different and different challenges, even at countries that are neighbours. And so it's a lot more complex than just going, yep, Europe wants LNG, so let it flow. I think there's a lot of nuances and very specific locational challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to offend you, but in the consulting world, right, when 10 countries make up a small tranche, we just write others. So sorry, Markus, coming back to you.
I think LNG will play overall in Europe an important role, but I think the importance is to understand that it is yet not settled so Europe overall doesn't have an energy policy. There's no European energy policy in place. But the sources of primary energy are getting very, very fragmented. There is a lot of renewables coming on stream. They are already on stream. In fact, there are some times of the year where Europe doesn't fears lack of renewables, but fears excess of renewables, and then they need to switch it off if they don't have battery storage or hydrogen or other stuff, what to do with it. I think it's more a question of what market share will LNG be able to take in this very, very diverse energy portfolio that Europe is heading to, right or wrong, but that's...
So if I just add to that, I think that I've spent a lot of time in Europe as well. The challenge is the message from the top and the guys at the gas consumers the politicians are saying, don't sign anything that's a long term. We have to net zero commitments, 2030, we need to get rid of all gas, etc. While I talk to the utilities and saying, we need gas today, but we can't sign long term. And we can't invest in your project because your project is by its very definition a long-term investment. And so they're not allowed to do what they know is the right thing to do. So they end up buying short-term and paying a lot more for it. So I think it's the European political machine that is at a different wavelength than the consuming machine.
Yeah, I mean, Europe doesn't have a pan-European or a broader energy policy, but they definitely have a fairly aggressive regulatory policy when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that's where some of the conflict comes in. I want to go back to this question of if you make LNG, they will come, right? You don't see that. Do you see that, Blake, in your business model?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to price at the end of the day to develop these projects. I think India is an excellent example. It really hasn't, I chased 10 years ago, went to India a number of times to chase FSRU projects, and there's always a big discussion about price elasticity. And there are a few existing terminals. There's Swan LNG in the Northwest, and then and on the West Coast, there's also H Energy has a terminal, and they've never gotten off the ground from an FSRU perspective because they're looking for the right price. But I think I'm seeing a lot of demand in the market, and I actually really liked what you said there about other, because a lot of the business that I'm chasing, if you look at the LNG business, China is the major importer of LNG. And every report I read, all they want to write about is all the demand for LNG is in Asia, particularly China, Southeast Asia. But most of my job I spend on other. And these are actually world scale projects. Typically the CapEx is about $500 million, including the mooring and the FSRU. You're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars of commodity, but they're in the other column in what you track.
And we are happy to do market studies in those other countries, Blake. So let's talk a little bit about costs, right? So Blake, what does cost look like delivered cost of LNG? And probably it's a wide range, right? Because we're looking at a lot of different markets. But if you had $3 for a million BTU of natural gas, right? What does delivered cost of LNG look like on the Gulf Coast using an FSRU?
Yeah, I guess most of all our projects are obviously in developing markets, and what you're looking at, I guess, as a rate, a general, it really varies, but you're looking at about $50 million of EBITDA a year to charter one of our vessels over, say, a 10 to 15 year period. Off the top of my head, it's probably in the 40 to 70 cents per MMBTU range on the regas tariff side.
Okay.
So, I mean, obviously, the US, there's been players out there who have undersold the price, and then the prices have gone up, and they've kind of got lucky sometime in the right place, right time. But, costs are going up in the US Gulf Coast. I mean, we used to think, oh my God, we're going to get to $200-300 a ton, $500 a ton. These per ton numbers can be played with and gamified in many, many ways. We all know that, but we're probably looking at somewhere close to $700 to $900 a ton now, if you're lucky. And we know some of the recent projects that come online have been well above that as well. So, the cost per ton is really an issue. I think we have seen a lot of cost inflation in the US. I'm worried personally about not only the steel tariffs, which we learned about just in the last 48 hours, but also some of the labor costs that have gone up. And if there is going to be this immigration cut down, not that there's a lot of illegal people on the job site, but it ratchets up from the other places. And so I do think that America is going to have to work very hard to keep its labor efficiency. And one of the ways that we have thought about doing that is to import modules, which is kind of makes a lot of sense. Let's make the modules somewhere else. If the modules get taxed 25-30%, suddenly we are in big trouble, I think, as industry.
So when you say that costs have gone up, one of the things that you mentioned about inflation, labor costs, and all that, but are costs also higher because projects are not getting done on time?
You know, I live in Australia, so it's kind of, I don't even live in America, but I'm American. And I've been in Australia a long time, and I've seen all the crazy cost overruns in Australia. What we have here is nothing. This is, chump change. In Australia, the cost, and interestingly enough, every Australian project was done by a super major. And they're all disasters in terms of cost and timing. They all went 40, 50%, if not 100% over budget, and they all went five years late. And the Shells and the Exxons and all these guys kind of got away with it. No one really blinked an eye. And here in the States, we've actually delivered all these projects amazingly on time. If I have to think of the single best company that's delivered projects, I don't think it's Venture Global, I think it's a Cheniere. Cheniere has delivered all their projects, 40 million tons, on time, on budget, without a lot of drama. No one else can say that. So I think, it's all relative. Yes, the projects are a couple years late. I think the difference in America is that we have a lot of projects that are in the very early stages, and the pyramid is quite steep to get to the next level and the next level. Once you get to FID, it's actually not that bad. We don't have that much delays. Golden Pass being the exception, and again, I wonder what the common theme is between them and the Australian project, so I'll let you think about that. But the point is that I think America has done a tremendous job of delivering things on time and on budget. We have a very flexible workforce, we have a very productive workforce, we have a very mobile workforce you don't have in other countries. But I'm afraid that we can't be resting on our laurels because the costs are 30%, 40%, 50% more than they were a decade ago or 6 years ago.
Yeah, but maybe, so I'm going to take a little bit of issue there, right? I mean, so I used to work for ConocoPhillips when ConocoPhillips did the projects in Australia, for example, right? And absolutely, right? I mean, all the projects in Australia were off budget, off schedule, and all of that stuff. But then those were also the first time those projects were being developed in Australia, right? I mean, how many LNG export projects were there in Australia in the early 2000s, right?
Okay, so Northwest Shelf has been there a long, long time. And then after Northwest Shelf, we had Pluto. So before that big second wave came along, which was suddenly the country could not handle it. And, we had 8 projects under construction at the same time in a country with a population of Texas, bigger than the US, continental US, and not a mobile workforce at all, and not a very productive workforce. We were going to have problems. And then I think there was a lot of, audacity, hubris in these companies. We had 3 projects built on a small island in Queensland, and I was there, I visited the job sites, and each of them had to have their own little ferry, to get to the island. It was like there was no incentive to work together. The government didn't have a lot of clout to push them together. And the same company was building all 3, but they were a completely separate operation. They couldn't even share a fire service together, that kind of thing. So they let the cost get out of hand. But in those days, it didn't matter because the LNG was rising. There was no other options, and the customer was going to pay anything what for it. And the projects have been okay economically in the end of the day. But in terms of project delivery, they were not great projects to be delivered. I think America has shown that we can deliver projects very well, especially when the Chenieres of the world and everybody else come along. And at the end of the day, I think we realize that LNG projects, the technology is off the shelf. There's nothing differential that Shell or Exxon or anybody else brings. The labor is the same trade labor that you have everywhere else. And the EPC contractors will work for anybody for the same price. So, and then project finance, when you project finance, the credit or the sponsoring company doesn't matter anymore. It's a project that matters. So I think we kind of level the playing field here.
Shaun, costs on small-scale LNG. What do you think you're going to sell your LNG for?
Yeah, it's going to be somewhere between $13 and $15 per MMBTU delivered. Sort of, again, that's the commodity, the pipeline, power, the terminal fee, and then the eye-wateringly expensive US Jones Act barge. So the good news is it's a level playing field for everybody. You've got to have a Jones Act vessel. The bad news is the Jones Act vessels, the dollars per cubic meter are just...
So the last mile that kills.
Oh, it's brutal. It's brutal. Which again, and there's a positive aspect to it, I guess, in that you really have to have a great deal of utilization to kind of drive that unit rate down. And so location. If you're having to go, we're not going to see competition in Galveston Bay from any of the export projects that are 50, 100, 150 miles away, because that Jones Act barge utilization will just cripple the price. So again, from the small scale side, you've got to be really close to the market. That's a positive aspect. But again, it does mean the price goes up. Now, if you're talking the large scale export projects are anywhere from, let's say it's $3 to $3.50 now for the tolling fee, and that's on 20 years. Surprisingly, when, for a 10-year, we're not horrific. But again, economies of scale does make a difference. But at the end of the day, we're comparing against traditional fuel oils, and in the Galveston Bay, you've got MGO at around, $650 to $1,000. We're just around, sub to just around $600 a ton. So forget all of the positive emissions, forget all of the positive decarbonisation. We're simply a more cost-effective fuel than the current marine options. When it comes to comparing to Europe and Asia, you've got pretty high prices at TTF plus trans-shipping terminal fees and barges. So you're right now in a low price market, you're still around $17, and then JKM again is in that same vein. And the volatility in both Europe and Asia means with the way the rates are designed in the small scale, most of it's fixed, and it's just your Henry Hub volatility. And so at least you might not be always the absolute cheapest price, but over the course of 10 years, you will always be down at the bottom end. So it makes it very competitive to alternatives in other markets, if those container vessels or VLCCs.
So that $13 to $15 a million BTU, how does that compare to methanol, for example, which I'm assuming is the alternate, is the next most competitive?
I mean, I don't even consider those an alternative. It's traditional fuels. I think in the IRA, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, they had something like $3 per kilogram of a subsidy. That's around $28 per MMBTU. If you're having to subsidize fuel for $28, I'm not worried about methanol competing with a base, $13 to $15 per MMBTU. And even in the industry, about 2 years ago, one of the big players, Maersk, told everybody, we're not doing LNG. We're skipping that phase. We're going directly to methanol. And they ordered, I think, 10 methanol ships. This summer, they came back and said, we think we made a mistake ordering those ships, and we're now ordering a fleet of LNG-fueled container vessels. So there have been some folks who've kind of, went with show my age now, went with Betamax, when really you should be going with VHS, right? That's going to be...
Even the Betamax was better.
The Betamax might be better, but the VHS is the winner.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think the more that there's this confusion around what the alternative fuels are, is it methanol, is it ammonia, which, by the way, all come with their own challenges. You just mean that you don't get any scale in any particular fuel, but LNG, it already has a tremendous amount of scale anyway. So I think it's going to come out on top, at least for the next, 15, 20, 25 years. These vessels aren't going to be scrapped anytime soon.
Markus, tell us a little bit about what Hoerbiger's offerings are around methane reduction, because that's, selling into some of the European markets, right? That's going to be a key part of improving the sustainability footprint of LNG supply into Europe. So I guess, what are the challenges that you see there, and what are some of the technologies that you are working on?
So our focus is on the reciprocating compressors that you have throughout the value chain of natural gas and in LNG. And we are basically trying to maintain all of the fugitive emissions that happen naturally from the system and from the design of a compressor, and recompress it and maintain it in the system. And I think that's going to be a key enabler for running those regulations that, for instance, in Europe are going to be mandated in the future. And quite recently, Australia has signed up to those as well. But I think, aside of the emission side, and we see on next level digitalization is the cost focus, because I believe, at the end of the day, there's not going to be a strict rule in Europe about methane intensity. It's a regulation. And I think those countries that can supply LNG at the lowest cost, as close to the regulations as they are, they will just take the majority of the market share. And here, what we see, especially in the US, is this great innovation power of the industry. I think the analogy that was brought today in the morning is fantastic. You can have all of the tailwind that is available. If your ship is not built properly, it's not going to take advantage of that. Sure. And so we are in the really lucky situation that we are challenged as a technology provider from the industry with ideas that. So we were in one of the customer meetings about telemetrics and integrating monitoring into equipment reliability and performance to reduce cost. And while we were like set up for a meeting that should take an hour and would be very interesting, the meeting was basically over after 5 minutes because the customer said, you can queue up in the line of all of the other technology providers that sells us a new monitoring system. Nobody's interested in that. It's just like reading what has happened in the past. If you want to add value, you're going to tell us how long our equipment is running before I can do the next maintenance. Because if I do it too frequently, it's too costly. If I do it not, I have catastrophic failures. So while I was like thinking, how complicated can that be? Then looking into the face of our development team, they were shocked that I have basically told the customer, I think we can do that. But here we are now, a year later, being able to tell operators of compressors how long the remaining useful time of the equipment is, which means a tremendous leverage on the cost of operating that equipment. And we would have never started that if there wouldn't have been an insisting customer that said that is what we would consider value. The rest we already have. Do
you find the customers different from the big to the entrepreneurial companies? I mean,
yes.
Because now we have a lot of terminals in Europe not done by the big companies, but by other companies.
The innovation power is with the entrepreneurial-driven companies and not by the, you've mentioned that before, by the big names only.
Or those TSOs or things like that.
There's enough innovation what we see there, but the dynamics that we're getting at the moment, well, especially in the natural gas side, is from those type of companies that know exactly what technology they now need to make the next step in their competitiveness.
Blake, one of the things that I read about as an advantage of using FSRUs is, for whatever reason, if you need to move, right, you can move to. Does that really happen? Do these FSRUs truly move over periods of time? Because once you're there, you're supplying LNG. Customers start relying on that supply, right? So I'm curious, like, how often do FSRUs move, and what does that mean time look like if there's one?
Yeah, one of the value propositions of FSRUs is they're faster, more flexible, and they're lower cost than a land terminal. That was the jingle many years ago when we started the industry, and it's actually proven out. As an example, Energos was built on the back of the Golar LNG FSRU fleet, and I used to be at Golar LNG. There was a vessel called the Golar Freeze. The Golar Freeze is now called the Energos Freeze. But that vessel, when I did the first contract on it was in Dubai. It was chartered to Dubai Supply Authority for gas into the United Arab Emirates. Shell was providing the LNG. That vessel then, after a number of years on charter in Dubai, went to Jamaica and was supplying regasified LNG into Jamaica. That vessel is now finishing a yard period and, cross my fingers, is going to go to a Latin American country here in the next 6 months on a pretty fast-track basis to support an LNG to power project. There are multiple examples of this. Another great example is our vessel, the Energos Eskimo, is in Jordan, It's been there with the National Power Company of Jordan. And then you might have seen recently in the press that the vessel is going to be repositioned into Egypt. Egypt is moving towards its third FSRU, and now there's rumors it's moving to the fourth. And these have all been, you couldn't take a land terminal and do that, but you can do it with an FSRU.
So, any chance that you could actually put one of these on the Gulf Coast and make LNG, or that's just a crazy idea?
Yeah, so I thought you were going in a different direction, but I'll hit on both of them. Is with respect to floating liquefaction, I spent a good bit of time chasing those projects at Port Lavaca. That would have been a handsome project had it actually happened. There's a Delfin LNG project, which has maybe a new life with Trump coming into office. But yes, you can take gas, liquefy it, and then export it. There are a few projects out there today, Congo, Malaysia, Cedar LNG in Canada, and then there in proposes a Delfin LNG projects and also there's projects in Mozambique with Coral South FLNG. But where I thought you were going with that, which I'm interested in if there's a reaction from the panel, is a lot of these terminals, the question is, do they have enough storage? And an idea that we've had is beyond just floating storage regas units, we have floating storage units. So taking an existing vessel and using it as storage as buffer stock, also to deal with, to give an existing LNG export terminal buffer stock and optimize their supply chain. That's kind of a question is, could you park 4 or 5 of these in the Gulf Coast and do FSUs? We think there's an opportunity, but I need someone like Vivek to say, Blake, I need an FSU, and we'll get him one.
Well, I wish I could. I think it's great because the biggest, typically the LNG export terminal, the constraint is to build a tank, and the tank's very expensive, especially on the Gulf Coast where you have to put 1,000 piles in because it's all mud. And this is the part of the most expensive, the most risky part of building an LNG terminal on the Gulf Coast is the tank construction. That's where things can blow out of proportion. But as far as I know, the US authorities are not too excited about ships like LNG tied up on a semi-permanent basis, especially not on the Mississippi River. I don't think they like that very much. So I think that's going to be a bit of a non-starter until we get over that. I think it's a great idea. We've seen it in other parts of the world that we can use the floating storage till we build our own tank and get early gas, for instance, for 2 years. That'd be great. But I just don't see it as well anytime soon.
Actually, we have looked at an FSU, and I think Blake might know this. So we're looking at, it's not as far along as Galveston, but we're looking at a bunker facility on the Pacific side, down in a port called Salina Cruz. It's that very narrow isthmus down in the south of Mexico. It's about equidistant from the Panama Canal entrance and to LA Long Beach. So that's quite a lot of coast there. There's a gas pipeline runs from the Veracruz side down to the south. That's heavily underutilized, and so we've been working with Pemex about getting indigenous Mexican gas supply, a lot of gas that's being flared down to there. Of course, it's in the ring of fire, and so building a small tank onshore becomes very, very expensive because of the geotechnical, geophysical kind of presence there. And we're inside a breakwater in the port of Salina Cruz, and so we actually talked to Energos and some of Blake's team at the idea of this potentially could be a slightly more cost-effective storage, even though the storage itself is a little oversized. But from placing it in a floating situation versus having to build on land, the trade-offs there could potentially work. And what also is interesting, unlike doing a Jones Act vessel that's shuttling around Galveston Bay, because the distance is a lot greater on the Pacific side to what would be key bunker markets, Panama Canal and Long Beach, you need a bigger LNG bunker vessel. And so that, in the US, you may see something in the 6,000 to 7,000 cubic meter range, but you see internationally, these 20,000 cubic meter vessels. So you do need more considerable storage because you've got bigger slugs of LNG you're putting in, and then those vessels are going to be gone a little bit longer. And so the FSRU FSU has some potential there. And I know you're probably thinking, why would you want to bunker LA from all the way down in Mexico? And the answer is easy, because you can't build anything in California, so you might as well do it from Mexico.
And not use Jones Act.
But if you build a bunkering facility from one of those export projects in the north, that's much closer. Because that gas is coming from the Permian Basin, has a DOE export license, we believe that you're required to use a US Jones Act vessel to do that, and that becomes prohibitively expensive. So while the distance is longer, there's method to the madness. A non-Jones Act vessel actually makes the value chain from molecules and then infrastructure to, let's say, LA Long Beach, to be actually more competitive than a northern Mexico export project that is having to fill a US Jones Act barge. That's a bit of a long-winded alternative to the Galveston project, and snuck in FSU.
So we are coming up on time, so let me open this up to questions. The good news is Vivek has a trinket for you, for everybody who asks a question.
I do. Not too many trinkets, so there won't be too many questions, but I have a great trinket. Yes, ask a question, you get a trinket. I think that's fair.
So maybe a question for Shaun and Blake specifically. We get involved, our team has worked with Asbil in Japan on digital twin for LNG vessels, voyage planning. And so we keep an eye on what's going on with dual fuel, ammonia-based marine power and shipping. So my question is to you guys, help me understand what is no longer hype, but is actually investment. All the reporting is that there are a number of vessels about to launch that are either dual fuel or ammonia. Ammonia is half the energy density of LNG, and so it's just very hard to understand, wrap my head around why. What is the driver with the safety and the emissions, the NOxes? So since you guys are in that space, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Do you want to go first?
So the question is around why ammonia versus LNG? It's really driven by the energy transition, and the goal is to get to zero emissions, because ammonia you can crack into hydrogen. With that said, there are a lot of challenges with ammonia from being corrosive and handling of it. So the jury's out. One of the things I wanted to mention on the innovation side is we have floating storage and regas units, which take liquefied LNG and regasify it into natural gas. There are concepts out there that have been approved by Classification Society to have floating ammonia vessels, but it's concepts. And as you know, that the Japanese basically invented the LNG industry in scale, and they're actually behind a lot of the development for ammonia imports. The million-dollar question is, can you burn ammonia on scale on a power generation in a generator? And if you can, then the demand's there. Then the industry is going to start to get there. But there are a lot of challenges. But I think the core of your question is, it's all about the hydrogen. You can crack ammonia into hydrogen. Hydrogen is going to get you to zero pathway fuel.
I'm a cynic about some of this stuff, and so this is just me being candid as opposed to maybe what's out there. But I used my example of Maersk earlier about announcing methanol, and then 2 years later, some of the Asian, it seems mostly in Asia, you've seen the ammonia play. Again, I don't know whether that's government driven, because a lot of those energy companies tend to be sort of very close to the government, and we're going to do ammonia, we're going to do methanol. The cynic in me, when you hear some of these European shipping companies do it, is the dual fuel. It makes great press, it's great for the share price, and they're never going to use ammonia, and they're just going to use traditional fuel, get a pat on the back, because certainly the the adder for the bit of the development for the ammonia is not a huge cost. Whereas if they said we're going to do LNG, you've got the tanks and the whole systems, it's a little more expensive if you do commit to LNG. So I believe they're just kicking the cans down the road. They're taking pats on the back now, and they'll never use it. And it's a little disappointing, and maybe that's the cynic in me. But when I heard Maersk talking about the methanol, it just sounded like a total story. And now that they've reversed course, I believe that more than ever. So I don't believe any of these guys seriously taking that path. They're just makes great share price press and the whole ESG.
More questions. Today is oil and gas day. You'll get a much more optimistic response to that question tomorrow.
Optimistic or realistic? I don't know.
More questions on gas, LNG.
Just a general question for you guys. We talked about LNG offtake being a long-term nature of the business. Where do you see the market today? In its development and movement towards more spot trades. Do you think that LNG will ever become as liquid as oil?
So I have a strong opinion on this. I think that the worst thing that's happened and continues to happen in our industry is the bankers insisting on long-term contracts. And the premise is, oh my gosh, I need to support, you need to have a 25-year contract because I'm going to give you a 25-year loan. And if that A customer drops off, you're going to shut down the plant. Well, obviously that's not what we do. And the analogy I've always used is, when I buy an apartment, I get a mortgage for 30 years, I can show the bank my 1-year lease and they'd say, oh, that's how much I'm going to rent the apartment for. And the renter goes away, I'll get a new renter for year 2. But the philosophy still is very old school. There's only 5 customers in the world that want LNG. And if Tokyo Electric falls over, you're going to shut the plant. Well, obviously, that's not the case today. We have an infinite number of people trying to buy LNG. So the bankers have had it really good because there's nothing better for them than to have a 30-year locked offtake against a 30-year contract. But, I think that really has to change. We need some bankers to step out and say, this is ridiculous. If you have a good LNG plant that's competitive on the Gulf Coast, just like I'll finance your refinery without 30 years of diesel offtake, why can't I finance your LNG plant? And like the same problem you're facing, right? Your customers don't want to sign 30 years.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because in the small scale bunker space, it's quite a locational challenge. We gaze across at Europe and you've got a bunch of LNG import facilities, and so the frequency of LNG carriers delivering into those import facilities is a lot less than the frequency of carriers in the US Gulf export facilities. So when I say you can't find berth slots in the US Gulf for bunkering, you can in Europe. And so there's this transshipping option there where the tanks are full of LNG, there's no LNG carriers holding those berths to ransom. And so you've seen a spot type of industry pop up there. And so on that side, the shipping industry is like, well, this is great. Now, as the demand grows, the interesting challenge there is not the long-term nature of the offtake. It's the long-term nature of building new LNG bunker vessels. So there's a ton of orders have been announced.
Sorry, Shaun, I have to cut you off because we are at time and we have a panelist here who needs to catch a flight. We have another panelist who's catching a flight after the next panel. But Francisco and you can catch up maybe offline. But I want to thank this panel. Super interesting discussion. Thank you very much. Let's give them a big hand, please.